Imagine living in a world where your body was never truly your own. A world where a woman's sexuality was dictated by religion, custom, and the unbending rules of a patriarchal society that saw her not as an individual, but as a vessel. Welcome to medieval Europe, a time when passion was not about romance, when sex was rarely about pleasure, and when women carried the heavy burden of survival under laws written by men for men. Today, on this channel where we uncover the hidden and often uncomfortable truths of sexual history, we are going to dive into the dark truth of women, see sexual lives in the Middle Ages. If you think modern society still has far to go, wait until you hear what women endured hundreds of years ago. Sexuality in medieval Europe was shaped less by desire and more by doctrine. The church loomed over everything, marriage, family, intimacy, and dictated what was acceptable and what was sinful. For women, this meant their bodies were instruments of reproduction, tightly controlled and constantly judged. Virginity wasn't just a personal choice, it was a commodity, a bargaining chip, a guarantee of family honor and future prosperity. A young woman's worth was measured by her chastity, and her future husband's family might demand proof of it. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your entire reputation, and by extension, your family's reputation, depended on a bloody bedsheet displayed after a wedding night. But the loss of virginity did not equal freedom. Once married, women entered a new system of control. Marriage was rarely about love. It was a contract, a transaction that bound land, wealth, and alliances together. And once inside the marriage bed, a woman's role was clear: to produce heirs. Her husband had not only the right, but the duty to sleep with her, regardless of her feelings. To refuse was to risk punishment or social ruin. The idea of marital rape as a crime simply did not exist. A wife was expected to submit. The church even reinforced this, teaching that women must yield to their husbands as an act of obedience. Still, sex was heavily policed by morality. The church set out strict rules on when and how sex could happen, and these rules disproportionately burdened women. Days of abstinence were numerous, during Lent, Advent, on holy days, and even on Sundays. Sex was forbidden during menstruation, pregnancy, and after childbirth. A woman who failed to follow these restrictions could be accused of tempting her husband into sin. Her body became both a battleground and a scapegoat. And yet, despite these rigid structures, desire and reality were far messier. Affairs, seductions, and scandals existed in the shadows. Noble courts whispered of illicit romances. Taverns buzzed with tales of prostitutes who offered temporary escape from the church's rules. But here again, the consequences fell heaviest on women. Men who strayed were often forgiven as weak but natural. Women who strayed could be branded adulteresses, condemned, or even killed for dishonoring their husbands. Their sexuality was a double-edged sword, feared, suppressed, yet endlessly obsessed over. It's a chilling truth that in medieval Europe, a woman's sexual life was never about her. It was about her family's honor, her husband's rights, her church's laws. Pleasure was not her privilege. Duty was. And that was just the beginning of the struggles women faced in this dark, tangled world of desire and repression. To truly understand the suffocating world of medieval sexuality, you have to step into the shadow of the church, because its influence reached into every bedroom, every womb, every whispered desire. The church fathers wrote obsessively about sex, and nearly all of it came with fear and suspicion of women. Women were seen as both temptresses and weaker vessels, responsible for leading men into sin. The figure of Eve loomed large, a cautionary tale that painted women as the origin of temptation and downfall. Priests and theologians wrote manuals on when sex was permissible, turning intimacy into a kind of accounting system of sins. Sex was tolerated only within marriage and only for the purpose of procreation. Anything that hinted at pleasure for its own sake was suspect. Anything else was labeled unnatural. The woman's pleasure was almost invisible in these teachings. At best, it was irrelevant. At worst, it was seen as dangerous. And yet the church needed women. Without women reproducing, society would crumble. This contradiction, condemning women as sinful yet depending on them to give birth, shaped much of the anxiety around sexuality. A woman's womb was treated as a sacred yet risky space, one that needed to be policed to ensure it served God's will. That meant constant surveillance. Midwives were monitored, women were interrogated about their cycles, and suspicion hovered over anyone who seemed too free with her body. The fear of women's sexuality also spilled into accusations of witchcraft. A woman who was too knowledgeable about herbs, fertility, or childbirth could be accused of conspiring with the devil. Sexuality and sorcery became tangled in the medieval imagination. Tales spread of witches seducing men, stealing virility, or using their bodies to cast spells. These myths reinforced the idea that a woman's sexuality was not only sinful, but dangerous to society. And the punishments could be severe. Women caught in adultery might face public shaming, be forced to wear humiliating garments, or even suffer execution in extreme cases. The very act of desiring outside the confines of church-approved sex could be deadly. The message was clear. Women's bodies were not their own. They belonged to God, the church, and their husbands, in that order. But while official doctrine was suffocating, lived reality was often full of contradictions. Priests who preached chastity sometimes broke their vows. Monks and nuns had secret affairs. The gap between ideals and practice was wide. But again, women bore the brunt of the consequences. The church's obsession with control created a climate of fear, shame, and secrecy. Women learned to hide, to silence their desires, to play the roles expected of them. Their sexual lives were shaped by rules they did not create, and punished for sins they did not always commit. The shadow of the church loomed over everything, reminding them that even in the most intimate moments, they were never free. Beyond the walls of churches and the confines of marriage beds, another world existed, a marketplace where women's sexuality was openly traded, exploited, and consumed. Prostitution, far from being rare, was woven into the fabric of medieval towns. Brothels lined the streets, sometimes even sanctioned by city councils as a way to control male desire and prevent worse scandals. Yet, while men were free to indulge, the women who worked in these places lived lives of danger, stigma, and exploitation. For many women, entering sex work was not a choice but a last resort. Poverty, abandonment, or widowhood left them with few options. In some cases, girls were sold into brothels by their families, treated as commodities rather than children. Their bodies became their currency, and their survival depended on the desires of men who often viewed them as less than human. The conditions were harsh. Women in brothels faced disease, violence, and the constant threat of pregnancy. They were often denied the right to marry or leave their profession, trapped in cycles of exploitation. And while men could walk away with little consequence, women carried the scars, both physical and social, for the rest of their lives. The stigma of being labeled a prostitute followed them everywhere. And yet, paradoxically, prostitutes were sometimes tolerated, even valued by authorities. Town leaders saw them as a necessary evil, a way to protect honest women from being harassed. The church, despite its teachings against fornication, often turned a blind eye, reasoning that prostitution prevented worse sins like adultery or sodomy. This created a bizarre double standard, where women's suffering was justified as a safeguard for male virtue. But not all sexual exchanges happened in brothels. In noble courts, women's sexuality was another kind of currency, used to forge alliances, secure inheritances, or climb the social ladder. Marriages were arranged with little regard for affection, and a woman's body was part of the bargain. Even noble women who seemed privileged were trapped in a system where their sexual availability was dictated by political strategy. They might be married off as teenagers to older men, expected to bear children as quickly as possible to secure dynasties. Their pleasure, once again, was irrelevant. And for peasant women, survival often meant negotiating sexuality in different ways. A peasant wife might endure endless pregnancies and the physical toll of hard labor. A servant girl might face harassment or coercion from her master. Consent was slippery in a world where women had little power to resist. Sexual exploitation was a fact of life, hidden in plain sight, normalized by the structures of power that governed medieval society. This marketplace of the body, whether in brothels, courts, or fields, reminds us how transactional women's sexuality was in the Middle Ages. Their bodies were tools, commodities, weapons, and prisons all at once. They could be bought, sold, traded, or discarded. And through it all, women bore the weight of shame, while men enjoyed the privileges of indulgence. It was a system stacked against them, one that left scars lasting far beyond the bedroom. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, some things began to change, but the dark truths of medieval women's sexual lives cast long shadows. The deep suspicion of female desire, the obsession with virginity, the policing of bodies, all of these legacies echoed into later centuries and in many ways still resonate today. Reflecting on this history, it is striking how often women's sexuality was treated as something to be feared or controlled. Whether through the doctrines of the church, the contracts of marriage, or the exploitation of prostitution, women were rarely allowed to own their desire. Instead, their bodies were battlegrounds where morality, politics, and survival collided. And yet, amid the oppression, there were glimmers of resistance. Women found ways to navigate the rules, to carve out spaces of agency. Some women in convents embraced celibacy not as repression, but as a form of independence, freeing themselves from marriage and childbirth. Others used knowledge of herbs and fertility to assert control over reproduction, even if it risked accusations of witchcraft. Stories survive of women who took lovers, who defied expectations, who left behind traces of passion in poems, songs, and scandals. These fragments remind us that even in the darkest times, desire could not be entirely extinguished. The medieval period forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how power shapes sexuality. It reminds us that the struggles for autonomy, consent, and recognition are not new battles, but ones women have been fighting for centuries. The conditions may have changed, but echoes of these struggles remain in modern debates about sexual rights, reproductive freedom, and gender equality. As we look back on the dark truth of women's sexual lives in medieval Europe, it's worth asking ourselves, what lessons do we carry forward? How do we ensure that history does not repeat itself, even in subtler forms? The stories of these women are not just relics of the past. They are warnings, reminders, and in some cases, sources of inspiration. So now we turn the question to you. Which part of this hidden history shocked you the most? Was it the control of the church, the brutal realities of prostitution, or the suffocating contracts of marriage? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what surprised you. And if you want to continue uncovering the forbidden, the forgotten, and the fascinating stories of sex throughout history, make sure to subscribe and join us for more. Because the past still has secrets, and together, we'll keep bringing them into the light.